Now, as we mentioned, right now inside of our shop page component, we are passing in these two properties where we get the loading states of our shop reducer in order to pass them into these components that we render inside of our routes. However, we do nothing else with these props, so it almost makes more sense for us to find a way to pass these values into our collections overview with Spinner in their own isolated environment rather than pollute our shop page component, because there's nothing that the shop page component can do with this other than pass them into these values. The reason why this is redundant is because our shop page, as for all our components, should be as dumb as possible. There's no reason for them to know about things that they don't need to know about. So for example, our shop page doesn't care whether or not this component or this component is loading or not. These components should be the ones in charge of determining whether or not they're being loaded, or whether or not they should be rendering the spinner. And how we're going to do that is we are going to leverage our higher order components again, except we are going to use the concept of the container pattern. So let me show you what that looks like. So what we want to replace is both these components. And the first thing we're going to do is modify each one with our containers. So we are going to go to our collections overview and make a new file called collectionsoverview.container.jsx. Now, our container is pretty much going to be a component that gets wrapped in all of the higher order components that it needs in order to properly run the way that it expects itself to, the same way that we've got it here in this slice. So instead of wrapping our map states of props around our shop page in order to pass that value into our collections overview with Spinner, we're just going to wrap that map states of props with this value around this component instead, this collections overview with Spinner, which in turn is pretty much just our collections overview being wrapped by our with Spinner. So it's just two levels of wrapping that we're going to do inside of this container component. That's all it is. I know it sounds complicated, but that's really all it is. And let me show you how that looks. So what we need to do is we need to import all of the libraries that we need in order to wrap all the code that we have. And what this will start with is actually our connect, right? Because we know we need access to both those selectors and the state to determine whether or not this component should be loading. We also need to import create structured selector because we're going to write a map state to props. And we're also going to import in all the selectors we need. So we need our select is collection fetching from Redux shop selector. And then we need to import our with Spinner higher order component. And then we need to import our actual collections overview component. And now we just got to write the same map state to props that we had in our shop, where all we were pulling off from our state was the select is collection fetching. The only difference is that because we're going to pass this property into our with Spinner, right, higher order component that wraps our collections overview, we got to set the property that we want to be named the one that the with Spinner is expecting. That's all it is. Because here we can manually pass it in by writing it as a prop. Instead, when we wrap it, we just want to make sure that the prop that goes in is under the right prop name that the with Spinner higher component is expecting, which is this loading. And then all we need to do is we need to export out the actual value. And the value will be this new thing called a collections overview container. This is simply equal to connect, right? Where we pass it map state to props. And then what we would do is typically, as we've seen, wrap it around collections overview. But we know that what we want to do is we want to wrap this collections overview component inside of our with spinner, which we can do by just wrapping it like this, because functions will evaluate from the inside out. So what will happen is this with spinner will first wrap around collections overview, giving us back our collections overview with spinner component, which then will get passed into our connect, which will then give it the is loading. Writing it this way is totally fine. However, this seems a little bit harder to read, right? It's a little harder for anyone to come in and see what's happening because of the fact that if we had more and more wrappers, let's say we had more higher order components, it would be difficult to fathom what's happening in the way that this is just wrapping more and more components, right? You can imagine if we had another with HOC here somewhere, right? That this would be too much. You can even see that if we wanted to wrap all of this with our with router higher order component that we get from React Redux, well, now this is really hard to read to determine what the actual order of everything is being rendered. What we can do is leverage a library. Or not a library, sorry, but another thing we can import from Redux called Compose. And what Compose lets us do is it lets us pass these in by just calling the function. So what we're going to write instead is compose and then pass it our connect and then pass it with spinner and then pass all of this our collections overview. And what this is doing is it's essentially currying all of our functions together. Compose evaluates from right to left. So what it'll do is it'll evaluate with spinner first by passing in the collections overview to that, and then passing that to our connect. The same way that we saw it earlier. This is completely equivalent to what we wrote earlier. To this. It's the same thing. So knowing that, it's just easier for us to reason about. And you might see compose be used from either the Redux library or the Ramda library, right? Which is another library that you might see in your projects, but that's all compose does. Is that it just allows us to evaluate multiple curried functions where the function returns another function that expects something to be passed to it and allows you to chain them all together like this. And now we just got to export this as the default collection overview container. And then we can just import this into our shop component. So instead of now rendering this collections overview with spinner, we just render our collections overview container from the .container path. And now we can switch back from a render to a component and remove any use of this selector because we don't need it in our shop page anymore. Because our container is handling all of that information. Now if we look, we'll see that our application behaves the exact same. So we know our code is working. So now what we can do is do the same thing for our collection page with spinner, right? The difference is now we got to modify our collection page component. Here we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to write our collection.container.jsx. We're going to import in connect from React Redux. We're going to import in compose from Redux. And we're going to import in create structured selector from reselect. And then we're going to import in our selector. So we can actually take this from here. Our select is collections loaded. We're also going to import in with spinner from components, with spinner component, as well as our collection page component, right? And just as we did before, we need our map state to props, and we're going to use our create structured selector But if you remember, we need to inverse the value that we pass into our isLoading. So what we can actually do here is we can actually pass it a function that will get the state. And this will still memorize our selector if we pass it our selectIsCollectionLoaded, passing in the state here. And then we are going to make our container, so our collection page container, capitalize the A, which is equal to our compose call, passing connect with our map state to props, passing in our with spinner, and then finally passing our collection page. And then exporting this as the default value of this component. So the only new thing that we did here was that we used a function instead of what we did inside of our previous container, which was our collections overview, right? Or any other map state to props where we use create structured selector, we passed in a function instead of just passing the selector. We just passed the function which gets the state as well as the own props, right, into our selector. And this will in turn create the selector for us. And then we are just going to replace this with the container value. I'm going to get rid of this. We're also not going to need this anymore. And now all we need to do is pretty much just replace this the same way that we did earlier. Get rid of our map state to props because we don't need that anymore. Switch that to null. And now if we save and get rid of this prop, well, we see that we have an error. Cannot read property title of null. Oh, whoops, we have to switch this. That's what was the whole point of that, so that we could reverse this value. And now we see that our component works, right? Our code relating to anything we need with our selectors is isolated into each respective container. And look how much smaller our shop page is. It doesn't need to do anything other than just render the components on its routes. And that's really all it should do. Its only function is to create and initialize the asynchronous request for fetching data, and then passing components into its routes. And this is the ideal kind of setup using the container pattern for moving all of our code that we need into its own respective components. Now, hopefully this was not too much of a challenge for everybody to follow, but if it is, that's perfectly fine. Honestly, when I first worked on my own React Redux project for the first time in my professional career, it was a daunting task of doing this pattern so many times for months before I was able to fully understand all of the moving parts of React and Redux. If you guys don't get it all in one shot, don't worry. It's a lot and it's really challenging. But this is going to be the most common pattern you're going to see at some point of your professional React career. Now, at this point, of course, more practice goes a long way to understanding all these things that we've done. You can, of course, always just move any connect code that we have around a component, such as our cart dropdown component, into a container file, because that's really all it is. We're just wrapping the base component with some higher order components that we put inside of a container file. You can do that for practice. You don't necessarily have to, but this is a matter of just iteration, right? The more and more we do this, the better and better we'll understand why we do all this, as well as what those steps are going to be and what files we need to make. It's just practice. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about another common library that's used to handle asynchronous actions in Redux. It's going to be very similar to Redux Thunk, except with a bit more flexibility. And I'll tell you all about that in the next lesson.